With a snap of his head, our Springer Spaniel Chip bolted into the underbrush. A heartbeat later, 3 grouse burst skyward from behind a mossy stump, their wing beats loud, wild, and unforgettable. For a breathless second, the forest felt alive with chaos. I stood frozen, barely old enough to understand what I was seeing, but the wild flush imprinted itself deep within me at the age of 7. On that crisp autumn afternoon, bathed in golden light, I first felt the stirrings of a lifelong fascination with upland birds and the land they inhabit. Upland legacy in a suburban century. For generations, upland bird hunters roamed the wooded folds of New England, drawn by the deep-winged thunder of ruffed grouse and the fleeting flush of woodcock. Southeastern Massachusetts, never quite a grouse stronghold, still offered enough promise to stir hope each autumn. The patchwork of forests, boggy thickets, and forgotten farmland held birds for those who knew where to look. My father's band of hunters, together with their well-trained setters and our Springer, moved through these coverts with anticipation, alert for the sudden whirl of a feathered escape. As a boy, I remember their voices rising from the kitchen at first light, coffee steaming in their mugs as they mapped out the morning's hunt. Then they'd depart, and I stayed home. Finally, I turned 12, old enough to join the hunt. On that first outing, I didn't carry a gun. But in a sandy clearing on the edge of cover, my father handed me his opened Belgian Browning, superposed over-under. I felt the weight and cradled the gun across my right forearm to drop a shell in each barrel. I took aim at a sandy sloped hillside and touched off a shot, blasting a spray of grit into the air. My right shoulder felt sore. In the excitement of shooting this gun for the first time, I never felt a kick. That bruise became a badge of honor. Later that afternoon, a setter stood tensely, staring at some scrubby maple. 2 birds rocketed from behind the trees. Someone shot, and moments later, Chip trotted into sight with a grouse in his mouth. I still remember the heft of this bird, the soft stippling of its mottled feathers, the way its eyes stayed wide and glassy. The golden days of grouse hunting in southern New England slipped away since my father's time, and even from my early years as a fledgling bird hunter. Born from abandoned farmland, the region's forests created ideal coverts, dense with young maple, birch, and scattered pines. But over the decades, the slow creep of suburbia devoured the countryside, swallowing fields and forests beneath a tide of concrete and cul-de-sacs. The place I first pulled a shotgun trigger now lies beneath strip malls and rows of identical homes with chemical-greened lawns. These weren't just places to hunt, but places where we spent our best moments, where my father taught me the ways of a grouse, and where I knelt beside Chip and hugged him after my first bird. These places held more than birds. They held time itself. Winston's Hill. Years later, my second Brittany, Winston, began as a striking but hesitant pup. Sleek lines, sharp nose, but cautious in the field. He took to the basics with steady determination, but during the early hunts he shrank in the shadow of the older Brittany, Deschutes, a relentless, ground-eating dog that tore through cover like a storm. Back then, my new home in western Oregon still harbored pockets of wild pheasants, and when a rooster crashed into the thorn-choked blackberry tangles, Deschutes barreled in without pause, vanishing into the thorns while I scrambled after, calling him out before he bloodied himself too badly. Meanwhile, Winston skirted the edge, pacing and whining, muscles tense with want, but unwilling to plunge into that chaos. Everything changed as Winston turned 3 years old. Shedding any hesitation, he hunted with a quiet intensity, his nose uncanny, his confidence unshakable. One fog-draped morning, he trailed a running rooster through waist-high grasses until the scent pulled him to a monstrous blackberry bramble, a seemingly impenetrable fortress of thorns and shadows. A single tunnel ran through the middle like a secret passage. The pheasant sprinted for this hole, banking on escape. Winston didn't hesitate. With a coiled leap, he dove headlong into the dark. For a moment, the thicket held him, rustling and snapping. Then he burst back out with a rooster clenched in his jaws. From that day forward, Winston hunted like a dog possessed, no cover too thick, no bird too wary. He had become a machine built for feathers and fury. We began pushing deeper into Oregon's Coast Range, discovering tangled, hidden pockets of habitat where grouse and mountain quail held tight. Those shadowed hills became my schoolhouse, teaching me about birds, seasonal shifts, and the subtleties of upland life in the Pacific Northwest. Each year, a generous landowner offered a permit program, granting access to sprawling tracts of successional forest deep in the Coast Range. Back then, when fuel was cheap and time felt infinite, I poured myself into the pursuit, logging many miles on washboarded forest roads and hiking steep terrain. Almost every hunt rewarded the effort, coveys of mountain quail bursting like bottle rockets from brush, the occasional blue grouse thundering from the ferns. One ascent etched itself in memory, the climb above a place called Lobster Creek, wound for miles up a series of brutal switchbacks on that private timberland. With a final push beyond a rusted open gate, still inside the boundaries of the permit lands, I pressed forward into a stand of towering Douglas firs, their trunks rising like cathedral columns, their canopy thick enough to smother sound and light, too mature to hold birds. The trees loosened their grip, giving way to a slope filled with saplings and brush, dense enough to hold birds, open enough to move through. Then came the sharp, electric chirp, 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 the unmistakable call of mountain quail. One step and the covey erupted, and birds launched in every direction. Some hugged the contours, skimming the brush like thrown stones. Others arced wide and vanished into the timber. When the barrels cooled, 2 birds lay still in the grass, enough for Winston to nose with quiet pride and for me to carry home for a September supper. Year after year, the covey answered our return, rising from the same brush as if conjured by the ghosts of hunts past. Each time we approached that slope, Winston lit up, eager and electric, unable to contain his drive. Even as his muzzle grayed and his breath grew short, he moved like a dog untouched by age, as if the land remembered him and lent him strength. I began calling it Winston's Hill, not only in passing but also in ink. I logged it in my journal and sketched its contours onto hand-drawn maps. It became more than a location, it was a landmark in our shared story. One bird opener, we returned to the familiar spurs and clear-cuts above Lobster Creek. After rounding the last corner, the road ended abruptly, sealed off by a locked gate. A bold sign barked, "No trespassing. Cameras in use." Beneath it, another placard bore the name of a new landowner, another timber company, this one far less welcoming. The years of permission to hunt had vanished without a word. Bird hunting nirvana no more. I once had access to a remarkable parcel in the upper Columbia River Basin where rugged topography and valley floor agricultural land collided to create nearly perfect upland bird habitat for the mixed species in this region. It was a place where pheasants ghosted through tall grass lowlands, quail darted along brushy edges, Hungarian partridge flushed in loose coveys, and chukar scrambled above, traversing craggy, sun-scorched slopes. At its peak, this entire drainage was open to public access through a hunter walk-in program. The land read like a textbook of upland diversity. Grain fields, shelter belts, creek bottoms, and basalt ridges woven across a landscape of ranches. I could cover it all. Pheasant flats to Chukar cliffs in a half-hour's drive, and nearly every stop held birds. But over a few years, gates closed. Parcels, once open to all, began slipping quietly out of the program. Though landowners retained the right to grant individual permission, many grew weary, disillusioned with the program, frustrated by careless hunters, and let down by what they received in return. The openness faded. One landowner leased his ground to a commercial hunting outfit. Another struck a deal with a tight-knit group of private hunters. A ranch with a thriving population of Chukar welcomed my wife and me back each fall until a consortium arrived with a checkbook and received promises of exclusivity. The gate closed behind us and didn't reopen. This latest season, new signs appeared at the upper end of the old access road, diverting truck traffic to a back route that skirted town, bypassing ranches that had stood for generations. The signs didn't just mark a detour, they marked a turning point. Something had shifted. I followed the rutted road, now chewed up by semis and pilot trucks, and reached a spot I knew by heart. This had once been pheasant ground, prime cover during happy hour, when roosters called from wheat stubble and hens rustled through the brush as the sun dropped low. But now the cover was gone. No tangled edges, no whispering wheat. Only scraped earth and gleaming stacks of steel. Power lines already traced the sky. New gravel roads carved the hillsides. Another wind farm had claimed a piece of the Columbia River basin. I stood there, staring into a landscape no longer recognizable, not just altered, but overwritten. This wasn't just habitat lost. It was another page torn from the book of my upland life. Like Winston's Hill, like the grouse thickets of my youth, all of it slipping from place into memory. I'm left with fragments, snapshots, stories, moments suspended in time, but not the land itself. The land has moved on, and yet not every gate closes. Loss has a way of waking the explorer within. Rather than let it anchor me in nostalgia, I've tried to let it fuel something else, a drive to keep searching, to push deeper into new country. My first hunting grounds may be gone, but I am lucky. I moved west. I traded shrinking woodlots for vast ranges, the stone fences of New England for the steep, untamed spines of Oregon's Coast Range and newly found uplands of the Columbia Basin, and now the outback of southeast Oregon. Here I found not only new birds, but also new ways of being a hunter. These places don't replace what I lost. They expand the story. They offer chapters yet unwritten, seasons yet lived. And in that there's hope. Because maybe that's the deeper lesson. Move on and the landscape always changes, and so can I.